Welcome to a series where we talk about the World Cup histories of each nation at the 2026 World Cup. Today we'll be talking about the most controversial host of an event that has had plenty of those before, will have plenty more in the future, and is about to have another one. Qatar is a small nation on the Persian Gulf with literally zero history at the World Cup prior to 2022, which makes their awarding of hosting rights to the 2022 tournament that much more confounding. Cash rules everything around us, and among other reasons, it's why we're talking about Qatar today, ahead of their first World Cup they've actually qualified for. There's deeper soccer history here than you might think, though. Qatar was a part of the British Empire from the first World Cup, Uruguay 1930, all the way until Mexico 1970. So that's a good chunk of World Cup history right there. But a tiny nation on the Persian Gulf was always going to be unlikely to be a part of a 16-team field anyway, and that's also true of the next two World Cups. Qatar would withdraw from West Germany in 1974 without attempting, so their first actual attempt at qualifying for the World Cup would be Argentina in 1978, and they didn't come close. They were drawn into a group with their neighbors Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Kuwait. The Emirates dropped out before qualification started, and while Qatar split their two games with Bahrain, both Gulf nations would drop their games against Kuwait and were both eliminated here and now. The expansion to 24 teams in the World Cup gave Asia and Oceania two whole spots at España in 1982, and that did not help in the slightest. They were drawn into an even tougher group with Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and their buddies Bahrain, and while they started this round robin with 2 out of 3 wins, they would lose their final game against Saudi Arabia on a late winner to be eliminated from qualifying. Qualifying for Mexico 1986 saw AFC qualifying reorganized a bit, with Oceania being spun off into its own region. East Asia and West Asia were split off from each other as well, with one country from each region qualifying directly to the World Cup. Qatar would be placed in a group with Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, who were so demoralized by getting the shit beaten out of them through the first half of qualifying that they withdrew halfway through. With the games against Lebanon being thrown out, Qatar got themselves in a position where a draw against Iraq would have gotten them through to the next round, but Iraq found a late winner and advanced to not only the next round, but eventually their only World Cup before now. Qualifying for Italia 90 would change once again, with the winners of 6 groups moving on to a single round-robin hex. Qatar would be drawn with Iraq, Jordan, and Oman initially, and this time they finally broke through. They spent their first 5 games winning at home and drawing on the road, and in their final group game in Baghdad, with a draw good enough to send them through, Qatar would equalize down 2-1 late thanks to an 85th minute goal from Adel Khamis. Qatar sent Iraq out and themselves moved on to the not hex, where they met China, the Saudis, both Koreas, and their bitter rivals, the United Arab Emirates. Here, things did not go quite as well. Qatar would only win 1 game, their final one, and while they finished 3rd place, just 1 point short of 2nd place, the team that pipped them was the UAE, which had to hurt. For USA 94 qualifying, Qatar would initially be placed in a group with a bunch of East Asian nations, and while they were mostly successful, North Korea would get 4 of 6 against the Maroons, and a second loss to Singapore ended their hopes. No almost hex for Qatar here. The expansion to 32 teams for France 98 meant another restructuring of AFC qualifying, where now the 10 winners of groups advanced to one of 2 groups, where the 2 winners advanced directly and the 2 second-place teams advanced to a playoff. Qatar's initial group here was India, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka, and good God, they destroyed all 3 of them. 14 goals scored, none conceded, 3 easy wins, and on to the next round for Qatar. At this point, Qatar was drawn in with China, the Saudis, Kuwait, and Iran, a tough but fairly balanced group. Things began terribly for Qatar though, only picking up 1 point in their first 4 games and being rooted to the bottom of the group. But then something funny happened. They won in Kuwait City, then they won in Dalian, and then they beat Iran 2-0, and because of that, they actually had a chance to qualify directly to the World Cup by simply beating Saudi Arabia at home. This is where their hot streak finally got doused by the Saudis, who found their glory instead. This was by far the closest Qatar had come to the World Cup, but they came up just short and ended up finishing 4th in the group. Korea-Japan 2002 would be the first time the World Cup was hosted in Asia, and given both co-hosts would automatically qualify for the World Cup, this left 2 more automatic spots and a playoff spot for Asia. Qatar had high hopes, and those weren't dimmed by their first group. They dominated with 5 wins and a draw and moved on to the groups of 5, where they drew China, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Uzbekistan. This is a dream draw. No Iran, no Saudi Arabia, no Japan, or South Korea. Qatar could win this group. Unfortunately, Qatar instead shit the bed. Drawing at home with Oman and losing in Tashkent is a horrible start. They recovered a bit from here, winning in Abu Dhabi and drawing against China, but China very clearly was the best team in this group. They were just randomly on a heater. Qatar was now playing for second place in the spot in the Asian playoff, but losing at home to the UAE on a late winner killed those hopes, and they ended up in 4th in the group. Once again, the bridesmaids and not the brides. For Germany 2006 qualifying, Qatar got fucked by the draw. They were the strongest team in Pot 2 and ended up with Iran and Jordan. Laos was here too, they just got destroyed in all their games. Qatar decisively lost their first game in Tehran, then they lost their second game in Annan, and it was over from there. Qatar got nowhere close to the World Cup this time. Qualifying for South Africa 2010 was a trip. Qatar would win a playoff with Sri Lanka to make the groups, where they would be drawn into the group from hell. China, Australia, and 2007 Asian Cup champs Iraq is rough, but top 2 advance, that is the one solace for the Maroons here. Qatar would lose both games to Australia, but they would beat Iraq home and away, plus take 4 of 6 from China. That actually was enough for Qatar to reach the next round in a group no one expected them to qualify from. Entering the next group drawn with Australia, again alongside Japan, Uzbekistan, and Bahrain, things started well when they dumped 3 on the Uzbeks, but that ended up being their only win from qualifying. Qatar would finish a distant 4th in this group, once again being not really anywhere close to the World Cup. It's at this point that FIFA awards the hosting rights for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, and in an uncontroversial move, FIFA would give the 2022 World Cup to Qatar, despite all the problems that would create. Qatar had only actually come close to qualifying for 1 World Cup. Well, they had never really had any real continental success, and I remember as a kid being extremely confused. Of course, cash rules everything around us, and Qatar's oil money brought them a huge platform on the world stage. I'm going to keep my opinions on this brief and focus on the soccer, but fucking yikes, this was a bad decision. In Brazil 2014, Qatar would make it out of their initial group despite drawing 4 games, and this got them into another group with South Korea, Iran, Uzbekistan, and Lebanon. Things went very similar to the last few qualifying campaigns. They started well, beating Lebanon, but would fall further and further away from the top 3 as the campaign went on, and they would once again finish 4th in their group, nowhere close to Brazil. For Russia 2018, Qatar's final chance to qualify for a World Cup on their own merit before they hosted in 2022, things started well. In their initial group, they won 7 of their first 8 games, only losing to China on the final matchday with progress already assured, and they would drop fucking 15 goals on Bhutan. Yeah, eat that, happiest country in the world. That got them to the non-hex, where things started out badly and never really got any better. Qatar would finish 6th place out of 6 teams and once again come nowhere close to qualifying for the World Cup. So that's every qualifying attempt by Qatar to try and make the World Cup before they hosted, but seeing as how they failed every single attempt, they would become the first team to host the World Cup as debutantes since literally Italy in the second ever World Cup. You would think that means Qatar is going into their own World Cup with basement level expectations, but in order to fully explore why there was some hope for the Maroons going into 2022, we need to detour real quick and talk about the Asian Cup. Initially, there's not much to talk about here. Qatar would qualify for their first Asian Cup in 1980 and would qualify for 4 straight during this time, but got grouped in each one of those appearances. They would qualify again in 2000, where they made it out of the groups for the first time, but they got dropped by China in the quarters. After 2 more group stage exits, they would host the 2011 Asian Cup, and here they did get out of the groups for the second time, and their game in the quarters against Japan was much more competitive, but despite taking a second half lead, Japan would bring it back and snatch a late winner to knock Qatar out of their own Asian Cup. The 2015 Asian Cup was an absolute disaster, with Qatar losing all 3 of their group games to Iran, hated Bahrain, and the even more hated Emirates. That brings us to the 2019 Asian Cup, held in the United Arab Emirates. This was the first 24-team Asian Cup, and it gave Qatar a significantly more manageable group with Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and North Korea. That's good because Qatar would be playing this tournament with a significant disadvantage. This Asian Cup was being held during the blockade of Qatar by a few Arab countries, including their group mates Saudi Arabia, and more relevant, the hosts the UAE. This meant no Qatari citizens were allowed into the country to root on their team. Despite this, Qatar started well. The win over Lebanon was something, but they did win that game, and then they dropped 6 on North Korea. And they were through to the knockouts on the strength of those 2 results alone. But for good measure, Al-Muwazza Ali scored a brace against the Saudis to send Qatar through in first place, 9 points of 9. This is already the greatest accomplishment in Qatar soccer history up to this point, and we're not even started yet. Qatar would draw a tough opponent in the round of 16 though, drawing Iraq, and this game was tense as all hell, but Qatar would take the lead with a free kick that beat the wall and the keeper, and the man who scored it was Bassam Al-Rawi, a guy who was born in Baghdad and had recently been naturalized as a Qatari citizen. Qatar would hold this 1-0 lead and knock out Iraq, advancing to the quarters to play South Korea. Here, once again, Qatar pulled a 1-0 win out of their ass, this time the goal coming even later from Abdulaziz Hatem, and this got them to the semis of the Asian Cup for the very first time. In the semifinals, as if this was a made-for-TV movie, Qatar would find themselves up against the United Arab Emirates. Given everything, this was the most important soccer game in Qatar history up to this point, and the Maroons would deliver in such a big way. The blockade derby was testy from the start, with Emirati fans booing the Qatar national anthem and regularly throwing shit at the Qatari players all game long. But despite this, Qatar would humiliate the Emirates, scoring 2 early goals before halftime and eventually winning 4-0, sending the UAE to the shadow realm and earning a lot of respect from neutral fans. The hosts tried every underhanded trick they could, but Qatar was on to the Asian Cup final, where they would run into the best team on the continent, Japan. In the final, Almaz Ali hit a bicycle kick early in the game, Hatem added a second not too long after, and Qatar held a 2-0 lead at halftime. Minamino would score a scrappy goal to get Japan back in the game, and remarkably, this was the first goal Qatar had conceded all tournament. A pen conceded by Japan and the following conversion by Akram Afif made it 3-1, the score the game would finish with, and Qatar would fulfill Xavi's prophecy. The people thought he was a fucking idiot, but Qatar fulfilled his prophecy by hoisting the Asian Cup and cementing the national team as an actual team worth looking at moving forward. In the run-up to the World Cup, Qatar would play in a few other international tournaments as guests in order to try and preserve the momentum from that insane Asian Cup run, and these didn't go quite as well. They would appear at the 2019 Copa America as invitees, and this has got to be the weirdest team to ever get an invite to the Copa America. They would get a point off Paraguay, but lost to both Ecuador and Argentina to finish with just a single point and at the bottom of the group. Qatar was supposed to be at the 2021 Copa America, but couldn't make it due to scheduling conflicts thanks to COVID. However, they would play at the Gold Cup in North America, and here they won their group and made it to the semis, where they would lose to the US on a late winner by freaking Yassi Zardes. That finally brings us to Qatar 2022, where expectations are all out of whack. You have people thinking they could go on a similar run to the 2019 Asian Cup squad, something like 2002 South Korea. You have people thinking they were going to embarrass themselves, and all kinds of takes in between. But they got a pretty tough group draw, all things considered. The Netherlands out of Europe, Ecuador out of South America, Senegal out of Africa. I wouldn't be happy about seeing any of these teams in this same group as mine. Qatar would open their maiden World Cup by hosting the very first game of the 2022 World Cup, their opener against Ecuador, and good God, Air Valencia scored immediately, had it ruled offsides on VAR replay, converted a penalty, and added a second for Ecuador before Qatar could blink. The mighty Almoez Ali missed a wide open opportunity just before half, and neither team did jack in the second half. It was a depressing start for Qatar, who became the first World Cup host to ever lose their opener, and this was probably their most gettable game. They needed a result against Senegal in their second game to even have a chance here. Qatar looked better in their next game against Senegal, but they still weren't close to the level they needed to be, and that's just sad. The defense would hold out until near halftime, but it was 2-0 not too far into the second half. While the Maroons would get one back via Mohamed Bantari, who scored Qatar's first ever World Cup goal in the process, Senegal did score a third goal, and we now have another multi-goal loss for Qatar, who became the first team eliminated from their own World Cup. Qatar would lose to the Netherlands 2-0 in a pretty boring game to finish with 0 points, 3 losses, 1 goal, and a -6 goal difference. If the 2019 Asian Cup was a dream, then the 2022 World Cup was a nightmare. Let's catch up to the modern day. Before we go over the Asian Cup, they did participate in the North American Gold Cup, and this did not go well. Qatar would lose their opener to Haiti, they drew with Honduras, and they only managed to scrape past the groups due to a 1-0 win over Mexico. In the knockouts, Qatar would draw Panama, and they got foobarred. This was a supremely disappointing result heading into their Asian Cup title defense. Qatar would host the 2023 Asian Cup and would try to run it back as holders, but after how they looked at the World Cup, yeah, freaking right. Qatar would be drawn with China, Tajikistan, and Lebanon, and while this wasn't quite as triumphant as it was in 2019, Qatar would win all 3 games and once again did so without conceding a single time. The round of 16 game against Palestine was more dramatic than you'd expect, with the Palestinians taking an unexpected lead before Qatar equalized and eventually took the lead on a controversial penalty call. The Maroons would win 2-1, ending Palestine's Cinderella run and moving on to play Uzbekistan. This game was a shit show. Both teams would score in regulation, neither goal was impressive. Then they played conservatively, went to penalties, and the Uzbeks just melted down. Qatar won the shootout to move on to the semis, where after playing a bunch of teams on their level or lower, Qatar would finally play one of the big boys when they were matched up with Iran. This game was absolute cinema. Iran took an early lead on a bicycle kick, but Qatar soon equalized. Both teams would trade goals on either side of halftime, and the game was 2-2 for most of the second half. This game was huge, given that the team waiting for the winner here in the final was not Japan, not Australia, not the Saudi Arabians. Little old Jordan was actually waiting there, so this was a prime opportunity. Much to the dismay of Team Melli, though, Qatar would find a winner late in the game and send Iran's latest golden generation down a doom spiral. Akram Afif was Qatar's best player this whole tournament, but he had the game of his life here and a very good time for the Qatar national team. Qatar would take on Jordan in the final, just a hilarious outcome for a tournament that has teams like Iran, Japan, and South Korea, but the game was pretty anticlimactic. Jordan would give away a penalty early, one that would be converted by Akram Afif, and Qatar held that lead until halftime. Jordan would equalize midway through the second half, but soon gave away another pen, one that would be converted by Afif. Holding the lead all the way until the end, Qatar would earn a third penalty, which would once again be converted by Afif, who got the exceedingly rare and hilarious penalty hat-trick. Qatar being back-to-back Asian Cup champions is unreal, especially given how the World Cup went in between, but it should give Qatar fans some hope moving forward here. Let's cover 2026 qualifying because this was an adventure. Qatar made the flip right back to being mid for this qualifying campaign, although initially things were fine. Qatar breezed past their first group and made it to the three groups of 6 stage where things took a turn. Drawn with Iran, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, North Korea, and the Emirates, this went poorly. Qatar would get humiliated in both games against the Emiratis, and were so up and down that they finished 4th in the group with the most goals conceded out of the whole group. Still, this was enough to get them to the next round, where they had another shot to qualify by winning a 3-team group. Drawn with Oman and the freaking Emirates again, Qatar would draw 0-0 with Oman and managed to get their revenge against the UAE to pip that top spot and back their way into a spot at North America 2026. We'll learn a lot about Qatar's national team at this upcoming World Cup without the pressure of hosting and a more traditional run-up to the World Cup. Qatar found out they would be playing their games in the bitter cold of Canada. Just kidding, it's summer, and Canada has a surprisingly warm summer in any of the places where games are being played. Still though, Qatar ended up in perhaps the easiest group they could have been. Getting the co-host Canada is nice, another team with very little history at the World Cup. They got Switzerland, another country similarly obsessed with money, and they got Bosnia and Herzegovina. I cannot believe that we're going to watch an honest-to-God World Cup game between Qatar and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Predictions time! This is how I have Group B playing out. I have Canada winning their opener against Bosnia 2-1 for their first ever World Cup points and win, while Switzerland knocks around Qatar 3-0. I have the Qataris losing their second game as well to Canada, meaning the Maple Men are going through to the next round. I do have Bosnia pulling a bit of an upset on Switzerland, opening things up for the final match day. Here, I have Qatar getting their first ever point by drawing Bosnia, while Switzerland beats Canada to win the group and put Canada down to second. We've got Bosnia in third place on 4 points, almost certainly enough to get through the knockouts for the first time in their history. And yeah, fuck Qatar, I guess. Well, I could be wrong, who knows? I don't actually have anything against the team, I just don't think they're going to do well. This was part 8 of 48, and we're now a sixth of the way done. Group B is finished. We're on to Group C next, and I won't bury the lead. We're talking about Brazil tomorrow, the big dogs, the winningest team in World Cup history, and I don't need to advertise the video any more than that. I hope you all enjoyed this one and stick around. Thank you so much for watching.